Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now, oh boy, do we have quite the news week. Not really any major focal point we're going to focus on, but just a lot of, I would say, medium-sized stories, if you will. We got a good hour ahead of us, and let's just jump right into it. Let's get into the Iran issue, which I know that you've been keeping up more with, so I'll let you take the lead on this one.
Sure. All right. So what was just breaking right before we started is the Iranian IRGC just tried to seize a British tanker. And this is in retaliation, and this is in the Persian Gulf. But this is in retaliation to a few days ago when the British they seized an IRGC tanker that was headed to Syria to fuel Assad. If you recall, Syria is in this sort of a situation where the U.S. and the Kurds have cut off the main regime from oil on the east side, and so they've only been able to get oil from Iran through the Persian, I mean, around the Persian Gulf, around the Arabian Sea, up around Yemen. And so what happened now is that on that route, the Brits were able to seize a tanker and stop it because the thing is that U.S. sanctions prevent Iran from exporting oil, especially to Syria. And so Iran today, they retaliated by trying to seize the British tanker. It sounds like they were unsuccessful in actually seizing it, but they were able to push it off to nearby territorial waters. And so this is clear escalation between the two. Now, is it going to amount to anything serious? No. I don't think there's going to be a physical conflict from this, but what you're sort of seeing is like something to akin to like an Indian or Brazilian traffic, where in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, there's just all these oil tankers. There's no real rules to the roads, and you have two opposing forces trying to enforce the rules, and it's not the lines aren't demarcated very well. So clearly there's a lot of hostility there. But what are your guys' thoughts on Iran's attempt to seize the British tanker?
Now, it struck me as weird because we are nowhere near where we were back in May or even back a month ago this time. And it seemed like almost, especially the British move, it was trying to reinstigate the tensions that were there when we were on the quote unquote brink of war, as some would put it. And it seems like it failed. And it's also interesting with, okay, so you had Theresa May, who is on her way out, not officially yet, but it's only a matter of time. I mean, by the end of the month, they're going to have a new leader picked, so she'll no longer be the prime minister. And everyone's banking on Boris Johnson. Now we look at him; he seems to agree more with Trump on the very pro-Zionistic, very anti-Russia stances, and I think that translates to his stance on Iran. So we could see British policy shifting in order to accommodate that. Whereas again, under someone like more Theresa May type, they were more willing to adhere to the deal, and they may just be seeing where the tides are turning and going along with that.
Yeah, I mean, I see this move by the British alongside Brexit is basically to some extent that's one of the negative impacts of Brexit. It means to be more entrenched within the American and Zionist empire, if you will. I would not that Britain lacked any of this kind of enthusiasm, but I would suspect that it will increase.
Yeah, it's
You
definitely
see this a little
emboldened
bit with, yeah, you see this with Brazil as well. It's like the cost of sovereignty from big trading blocs is that you have to have unequivocal support for Israel, or for Israeli policies and so on. I'm actually concerned. Like, how long can this escalation keep going before there is a conflict? I'm not saying it's going to happen in the next 2 weeks, but how long will this go on? I'm not sure. Second of all, how's this going to impact Syria? If Syria can't get oil from anywhere, they're literally going to have to attack the Kurds, and of course, America like what I'm worried about is that America actually succeeding in Syria. That's what worries me.
Well, one thing we also do have to consider is that the Russians have been shipping them oil via Crimea through the Bosphorus. But again, that's all contingent on Russian-Turkish relations. If things go south there, Syria is completely cut off from oil.
Right. Yeah, the only other way around it is that they literally have to go after territory where the oil is, and America, of course, will intervene to ensure that never happens.
It also seems that the British move was definitely directed by the U.S. And there's this sort of, I mean, there's this obvious rift between the British and the EU. You see that with Brexit, and the Brits are trying to sort of, be on Trump's good side. It seems like because Trump is threatening sanctions against European partners who are willing to work with Iran. And so, what the Europeans did to try to sort of what the EU sort of did to try to free itself from Trump and or what have you was they created Instex. We've talked about this
Right.
for over a few weeks now, and so just to put into perspective, what the Instex was trying to do was trying to give the EU economic freedom and sovereignty from the U.S. in making trade deals. That's why they were trying to loop China and Iran into the deal. And so what happens now with Trump threatening these sanctions, threatening to, basically he dissolved the JCPOA, but now he's attacking Instex, which is a totally separate other deal, like I'm explaining. And so what this is doing is obviously it's increasing the rift between Europe and Iran because Iran sees Europe as failing on now two deals, the JCPOA and now Instex. And so on the one end, it's bad because it's creating unnecessary tension between Europe and Iran. But on the other hand, it has ironically led Iran to just increase its economic trade with its regional partners. And this is extremely important because this has essentially, encourages Iran to take over Iraq, especially. And you're seeing this sort of covert war right now going on in Iraq between the U.S. and Iran for influence in the country, and Iran is just essentially bulldozing the U.S. in terms of influence and interest in Iraq, and killing off these sort of potential deals for Iran where foreign investment can't come in. They're just gonna hunker down more around them. So it's like they're creating a Persian Empire by
Yeah,
forcing them into having one.
I do want to expand on that. Another reason the UK may be so willing to play ball with the US is, of course, the leaked comments from the now resigned ambassador from the UK to the US calling Trump incompetent and a fool, which is just a paraphrase of what it was. So they may be like, okay, let's try to get on Donald's good side now. But in terms of the competition for influence in Iraq, I do have to take a moment to kind of laugh and kind of be frustrated the fact that, look, the reason we went into Iraq, we all know our greatest ally wanted us to go in there, but why? Because they knew Saddam Hussein was on the way out, whether or not the U.S. did or not, and they feared a pro-Iranian Shia regime would come to power. So, of course, they wanted U.S. boots on the ground to influence Iraqi politics. But look how that turned out. So pretty much we went through the mess all to prevent what we were trying to prevent in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
But what worries me is the impact of Instax, because if that's floundered, if that flounders, if that's halted by Trump, this is going to have reverberations into the future for quite a while, and it's another example of an entire set of countries that want an alternative to the American money financial hegemon. So it does at least show just how powerful America still is, and is Europe able to stand up to that? I doubt it. I think they'll fall in line. unless China puts a squeeze somewhere. I don't know, but um, that is something I was looking forward to. This alternative to SWIFT.
Yeah, you see the European nations being put into this caducean where they have to choose between Trumpism or the EU because they're not allowed to work with Russia or Iran or China or what have you. And so it really restricts the potential, economic or political potentialities for Europe because what Trump is doing is restricting them to the EU, and then Brexit is, you know, succumbing to this essential Trumpism for them. And so it's a lose lose situation for the
Mm-hmm.
Europeans.
Yeah, and interesting that you
Yeah,
bring that up
precisely.
because later in the show we have Slade to talk about Russia's recent deals with both Hungary and Italy, and I think it'll tie in pretty well with the topics we're discussing right now. But I'll just leave it at that.
Mhm. So just to wrap up the Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon area, just real quickly, a couple days ago, there was an attack in northwest Iran by Kurdish rebels. IRGC clashed with them, resulted in the death of some IRGC soldiers. The very next day, then Iran engaged in a bombing campaign in Kurdish-held areas in Iraq. And so this is just going back. There is this soft war going on between the U.S. and Iran. It's just happening in Iraq, and there's been reports today that in those Kurdish held regions in Iraq, U.S. officials and Iranian officials have been holding unofficial talks, which does make sense because what the Ayatollah and Trump have been sort of debating about publicly are official talks. Official talks meaning a summit like what Trump was holding with Kim. These sort of public official talks is what Iran refuses to do with the U.S., but it's not, you know, um, beyond imagination to think that the U.S. and Iran are holding unofficial talks, uh, for a myriad of reasons. I mean, I'm sure this is common amongst all geopolitical rivals, but this is the news that was coming out. In particular, the only named person that was in this meeting was Hassan Khomeini, the son of the late Ayatollah. But other than that, the U.S. officials have been unnamed so far.
I mean, not to get too optimistic, but we did see this in the lead up to the North Korea summit. Mike Pompeo, when he was still CIA director, now I doubt there's anyone that high profile at these meetings, was meeting with Kim Jong Un. But yeah, point being is you're right about the Iranians don't want to give Trump the PR victory of having the photo op with him, the Ayatollah, or him and Rouhani shaking hands, but they're completely willing to hold negotiations in a back channel manner.
Yeah.
Mhm. That's about it. That's all I have. You had some Lebanon news too?
Not much. It's just the fact that the U.S. has sanctioned, I believe, 3 lawmakers who are part of the political wing of Hezbollah, not the paramilitary wing. I mean, it's not like they're gonna make their way to the U.S. or Europe anytime soon, anyway. So it's more the look how tough we are on Iran and its proxies without really doing much.
Yeah, this is why sanctions are a lot more hurtful to Europe than it will be to Iran and all these other countries because, again, those people don't have assets here in the U.S. Whereas the European officials do. I mean, they may even have family here or what have you. And so sanctions they can be very bad, but sometimes you got to target the right people. I don't know Hezbollah's right.
Yeah, and now I do want to move on. Speaking of Hezbollah, that general region, something that may or may not be related to it, is somehow this story makes its way into our show roster as well. One Jeffrey Epstein. So you were the one who filled me in on this. If you want to take the lead on it again.
All right, so apparently Epstein does have connections to the Mossad, and this is being publicly played out in Israeli media. Right now, uh, Netanyahu as calling for the Attorney General of Israel to investigate Ehud Barak based on photographs of Barak at an Epstein apartment, which is kind of ridiculous because I'm sure Barak has equal accusations levied at Netanyahu. But my point being is that this Epstein situation is spilling over into international news for a reason, because there are international connections. It's undeniable. Ann Coulter even mentioned this, that there had to have been some sort of state sponsor behind Epstein. And it makes sense when you look at his background. Now, I'm not too familiar with his background, but just based on what I've gathered from Twitter friends and followers, Epstein just has been linked, whether by his former wife, Ghislaine, I don't even know how to pronounce this, Gis, Gis, Ghislaine Maxwell, and Leslie Wexner. They have links to the Israeli lobby and/or Mossad, and so it's not, um, you know, un- beyond imagination to think that Epstein was engaged in some sort of Mossad honeypot where they would trap essentially these high political officials into performing, the political interests of Israel.
Yeah, I mean,
And
you
so,
have these high-profile people like the Clintons were some of them. They had other political figures. They tried to tie Trump in there. So yeah, they've had people from politics, from finance, from business. Yeah, so they probably have a lot of dirt on it, if we're being honest. Any of them.
yeah, I mean, it's just interesting because what seemingly appears as like a criminal investigation, the fact that it's turning into, a main political issue in a whole foreign country just gives, cause for concern about what is actually going on, because are the Twitter bots that Russia supposedly engages in is nowhere near comparison to this. And then second of all, it's not like the US doesn't engage in similar bot related activity. I mean, there were the photographs of the mech people and the Saudi people and the JIDF having these rooms full of computers and people just running these bots. So
Yeah,
it's not
the Air
like,
Force in 2011 openly admitted running 20,000 quote unquote sock accounts to influence specifically the South Korean election.
yeah. So bot activity, it's like what that it pales in comparison to child trafficking by a foreign government. That's just beyond, you know, any level of interference that Russia or China or Iran could ever be accused of.
Right. You almost get the feeling that politicians are invited to this island, and whether they participate or not, they're expected to go. Now, just merely being there is the blackmail, because
Oh
anything can
yeah.
be insinuated afterwards. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think all power works that way. That they have something that they can shame you with, so that essentially the people dethrone you. But I have a feeling. I mean, I can't shake the feeling that this episode, this Epstein episode, is going to be Weinstein, where it's going to get a lot of attention, and in a few months it'll drop off the radar, and then a year later, something else will be done with it. I don't know if there's going to be an equivalent Me Too movement, but I wouldn't rule it out. You could even look at this bickering between Netanyahu and what's his name, Baruch.
Ehud Barak.
Yeah, yeah. You even this could have some element of staging to it. Of course, the alternative is that they are sincerely worried. If judging, by the what happened on the Wikipedia page, where Epstein came from a Jewish family, from a white family, then back to a Jewish family, then just a family. That was a shock. He was born into a family, and So maybe there is some meat to this. Maybe Netanyahu is genuinely afraid. I mean, he has his own legal issues. But it'll
Now,
be interesting to see how this develops. This is still very early on.
you mentioned old Harvey Weinstein, who also had ties to the Mossad. He hired former Mossad agents to act as bodyguards and blackmailers for any of his accusers. But one thing we also have to look at is I about a year ago, I think last June it was, called the Me Too movement a dog and pony show. It's where you have these women who were with these men 20 years ago making accusations to distract from the real problem. I would consider someone like Epstein part of the real problem. I think we're going to get something similar with this whole debacle involving Epstein. We're going to be pointing to things that are completely irrelevant to any of these things that mattered, any of the things we just discussed, and we're going to be like, oh, well, this, and this happened. Oh, Donald Trump. Oh, Bill Clinton. Oh, name any high-profile figure. We're going to get all these little things that lead nowhere while they slowly but surely cover up everything that actually matters.
Yeah, we talked about when Weinstein hired Black Cube to basically spy on former clients or what have you, victims. But that's some pretty interesting symbolism if you think about it too. The Black Cube here
Uh-huh.
spying on us. There's something very deliberate to all of this, just from how intricate and complex it is. It's not simple to say that these are all just pervs engaging in some sexual fantasy or what have you.
Yeah.
There seems to be something very well designed here at play, and the only logical explanation is the involvement of a foreign government, namely Israel.
Right. And maybe in a similar fashion, if that with regards to the Palestinians, it's been said before that if Israel wanted to, they could have completely eradicated them. On the other hand, not eradicating the Palestinians and squeezing out this slow death of a people is also a way to kind of flex on the world. Like, we can do this, but no other country can do this except us, and there's nothing you can do about that. Um, that makes me think, like, this Epstein episode in a way is small fry in comparison to that to the questions of Palestinian statehood and so on.
Mhm. Oh, and notably, Epstein had a cube temple on his island too.
Yeah.
Yeah, the pictures going around of that. Yeah, nothing at all conspicuous about Little St. James Island at all, or about the Lolita Express. All completely above board. This is all just coincidence. I'm sure none of these people who visited this island did nothing wrong, unless, of course, we're talking about Donald Trump. In that case, he did everything wrong on that island. But beyond that, I'm sure everything is above board, and Jeffrey Epstein is just this bad guy who hid it from all of these clients who visited his island, and no matter what. But I do have to say, in all seriousness, a lot of people, I don't expect them to take this deep dive into it, but this is one of the more surreal stories I've heard in a while, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. Same here.
Mhm.
Now, I suppose we've said unless either of you have any more comments on that, I suppose we can move on from that.
No, I'm good.
No,
Okay.
I'm good.
So what I had next was Ukraine. Now, some interesting developments out of Ukraine we haven't touched on in a while. So, President Zelensky's first act when he came to power in May was the dissolution of parliament. Elections will be held on July 21st, which is about a week from now. Now, according to recent polling data, Zelensky's Servant of the People Party is polling at 34.4%, with the closest contender being the For Life Party polling at 11%. Now, he hasn't really made much of an impact, but another figure standing for election is former Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili. That's
Saakashvili.
thank you. But yes, he's the one who, of course, threatened the jump of a building. Former president of Georgia, the one who ate his tie at the thought of any Russian retaliation to his actions. So, the drama queen of our era, if you will. Now, In an interesting turn of events, completely unrelated from our good friend, the former president of Georgia, the opposition leader Viktor Medvedchuk. Now keep that name in mind. It's a Western Ukrainian name that'll be relevant later. Now he said to Zelensky he has the opportunity to abandon Poroshenko's policy and engage in direct negotiations with the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. He also appealed to Zelensky's high approval rating, saying he should capitalize on it, saying, quote, as long as he enjoys this level of support, it's necessary to assume the stance that would be in the best interest of the whole country. So right here, we have a Western Ukrainian, and these Western Ukrainians are the ones that they've been pointing to as the neo-Nazis. That's who makes up most of the Azov battalion in the East, believe it or not. You have a Western Ukrainian, in politics no less, saying we need to engage in negotiations with Luhansk and the Donbass in general, instead of just waging a campaign on them and shelling them.
Yeah, I mean that is significant. That you're right. When a Ukrainian last name ends with Chuk, that means they're more towards that area, towards Slovakia and Poland and Belarus. That's pretty significant because the idea of a politician saying something like that, even 2 or 3 years ago, from that region, he would have been thrown into a garbage bin by Azov battalion on leave, and that hasn't happened yet, which to me says that maybe the average Ukrainian is ready to put an end to the conflict. I know Poroshenko, even though he's out of office, was accusing Medvedchuk of being a bandit. That he was tampering with Ukrainian sovereignty, which is hilarious because Ukraine only sees its ability to be a sovereign nation by having a guarantor with far more power than it as a way of gaining sovereignty, which is a contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, I'd hate to say it, but Ukraine has to choose between Russia or the West. There's no way it's going to be able to sustain itself. I mean, yeah, farm-wise, but it can't defend itself. If any crisis comes up, it's going to need a much larger partner on the world stage to work on its behalf.
There was a bit of funny news, too, that came out from this little tiff. So Russia recently submitted a draft to the UN. It's a draft resolution that basically calls for the US and Ukraine to stop supporting Nazism. It's like an anti-Nazism bill they're trying to the US draft into. And so right now, Russia should be Putin. He's like the head of Antifa in many ways.
Yeah, I mean that really isn't working anymore. It's not 2015. Everybody knows that, in a sense, they're only Nazis in so much as they are against Russia. The odd synagogue gets burned down, although I haven't heard of anything.
They'll harass some gypsies, but beyond that, it's just the fact that they fucking hate Russia, and honestly, that's as far as they usually take it.
Right. So, and Azov has ties with various Israelis anyway, so, or at least the Pravi sector, right sector. Yeah, so, I think it's more or less positive what's happening in Ukraine now. It's very slow. We probably still won't see anything develop this year. Who knows? Maybe the Ukrainians are waiting to see what will happen once Putin is gone.
Well, the best thing go on.
Yeah, I mean, I just think the kind of hate that they have for Putin in Russia, especially Putin, is kind of indicative of his kind of his ability to navigate the political sphere, to turn events around in favor of Russia. His shrewdness, his intelligence, I think that threatens them. And he does have a kind of a resolve. He's on the one hand very realistic about Russia's weaknesses, but he's willing to work with whatever strengths it has to gain a maximum outcome. And so far with what I just said in the equation, He's doing quite well. I think they might be waiting for someone that's incompetent.
Oh, watch, they'll get Lavrov next, and yeah, the problem will just perpetuate on their end. But point being is, I mean, we can only hope Lavrov is the next Russian president, because beyond that, I can't see anyway. I mean, it's either Shoigu, who would be way too hawkish and drive Russia into a conflict they could not win, into like a Afghanistan-style conflict that they've experienced maybe back in the 80s, or it's going to be someone like Medvedev, who is much too soft and is a Nicholas II figure, as you put it previously. But point being is,
Yeah.
with what's happening in Ukraine, you can see negotiations with the Donbass, which is Donetsk and Luhansk, just together. It would require some form of federalization, regional autonomy, which is probably the best thing that can happen for the Russians in Ukraine. So, with the way it's looking, they may get that. So, it's, as you were saying, just looking back 2014, 2015, if you told me that 4 or 5 years down the road, this would be the situation in Ukraine, that Russia would have the upper hand, that the sanctions were just rolling off them, that any of this would be happening, that, of course, someone like Zelensky would be president, I would have laughed in your face. But as time, it's, again, one of those surreal stories.
Yeah, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that life in Ukraine has not improved. They are not in the EU, and it may be a long time before they ever are. And I think after 5 years, they basically see that America is not willing to intervene. They're not going to go into Ukraine any faster than they did in Georgia in 2008. So I think that has a lot to do with it. I think it's a pragmatic assessment of the situation. For Donetsk and Lugansk, they will have to make an exception for them with regards to the language laws that Ukraine is now enforcing on schools and professionals. These are, lawyers, politicians, what have you, where it's forbidden for them to speak Russian or write in Russian or communicate in Russian in any way. That can't happen with Lugansk and Donetsk. Ukraine needs those provinces for industry, for coal production, and so on. It needs them. Even their port of Mariupol is to some extent threatened and hampered, even though it's in Ukrainian hands. It's less than 25, 30 kilometers is also the border with the Donetsk Republic.
Yeah, I mean, let's say they decide to return fire amidst the constant shelling. Things are not going to be pretty.
Right. And Donetsk has proven its ability to even enter into the suburbs of Mariupol. In 2014, they got basically into downtown Mariupol. For a while, it looked like it was a possibility that they would take Mariupol, and the truth is, prior to that, there were protests against Ukrainian forces in Mariupol by just local residents. So, it's a contested area, and giving those provinces a certain amount of autonomy would ensure also people who are outside of the provinces but are empathetic towards the Donbass, that maybe the country can move on and the conflict can come to an end, because there isn't any kind of economic growth, and waging a war that basically is good for America but isn't really good for anybody else doesn't serve Ukraine.
I mean, by the end of 2019, so, about 5-6 months from now, what do you think the total number of people who left Ukraine is going to be? It's probably going to be up to 5 million. I mean, it's at 4 million already. We're probably going to get another million from, especially the instability of changing in administration. Of course, just the Kerch Strait crisis going back even further. I don't see the situation getting better in Ukraine for the average Ukrainian. And look, they're either going to go west to Poland or east to Russia.
Yeah, I don't. This is not. I think the West. Here's my take. The West cannot be flexible. So, but they're also made brittle by it. That is, Russia in a way can cope with a Ukraine that goes west to some degree. because Russia is far more diversified in this regard in comparison to Ukraine. It's not like dependent on Ukraine, right? And the sequestering of Ukraine from the Russian sphere, it has made sort of life worse, kind of for everybody, but particularly Ukrainians and Europeans as well. So on that front, the West can't lose face. America can't lose face. It can't make it look like Russia won. However, like Russia doesn't need a victory out of it. Like the truth is, I think strategically, one of the reasons why Donbass has not been incorporated into Russia in the same way that Crimea has, when, like technically speaking, it would have been as possible, if not more, to do that. And one of the theories out there is Russia is ensuring that there is always a sympathetic Russian element within Ukraine in order to undermine Ukraine's, other Ukrainian positions in Ukrainian polity that despise Russia, that want Russia to be completely cut off, and so on. And so, if Ukraine is going to be an anti-Russia state, then Donbass is an anti-Russia state.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. The Donbass, if the Russians just leave it there as a punchback for the Ukrainians, it gives legitimacy to saying, look at how abusive the Ukrainian government is acting. But yeah, point being is, like I said, it's all just it's all surreal. And if you told me any of this 5 years ago, I would have laughed in your face. But moving on from Ukraine, let's move on to a brief story about German Chancellor Angela Merkel. So Merkel was seen shaking profusely again for the third time in public. Now, this time happened during the welcoming ceremony with the Finnish Prime Minister, Antti Rinne. Now, last time this happened, she was actually meeting with Zelensky, coincidentally enough. But the thing is, now, Merkel announced after last election that this would be her last run, her last term in office, that she would step down and allow somebody else to take power. Now, a lot of people, myself included, when they initially saw this, they're like, oh, the center-right, the establishment in Germany, it's on the decline, which I don't doubt that it is to a degree, but looking at the European Parliament elections with the underperformance of groups like the ADF and other populist groups, what we need to look at is the fact that Merkel may be in terrible health. Not necessarily that her coalition is slipping, which, like I said, to a degree it is, but nowhere near as to the degree some people do. But her health could be slipping, and she just wants to see her last term out. And you know what? Angela Merkel might drop dead by the time she steps out of office, or even a little bit before, because she's in her mid-60s. I believe she is 64 right now. And I don't have the video on me. I don't have the video on screen. But she is shaking. It looks like she is struggling to stand. Now, last time, of course, they said dehydration. They gave some other throwaway answer this time again. But I can say for a fact the woman is not in good health.
Yeah. It doesn't appear. She doesn't appear to be in good health at all. Yeah, you're right. I mean, who knows? In 6 months, she may leave even sooner, or she will probably just not attend as many public events.
Yeah, I mean, and this is honestly the best thing that could happen for the ADF or other populist groups, the fact that Merkel retreats, similar to, I guess you could compare it to, late-term Reagan, where he's starting to get senile and his age is catching up with him. He makes less public appearances. It's other officials in administration. It's Nancy Reagan making the appearances. We could see something similar where it is officials, people from Merkel's inner circle, governing Germany on her behalf for her last few years in office.
Right. You could look at, symbolically, Merkel represents perhaps, the failure of the EU in a sense, her shaking and teetering and you could look at it on a symbolic level, that it's that there is some kind of change is needed, and Macron doesn't younger that he is, and even I would say almost athletic. He hasn't become some kind of a leader, and I doubt he will even after Merkel.
Yeah, I mean, he was anointed to be the replacement of Merkel come the time she leaves office. He was anointed. He was going to be the face of the European Union, the very strong European leader that's going to stand up for our values, as it were. Going to stand up against the Russians. Going to stand up against the evil orange Donald Trump in Washington D.C., who's threatening Europe and NATO. But I mean, look now. As we discussed last week, the Yellow Vests they have petered out a bit. But point being, there's still high discontent with Macron in France and in Europe as a whole.
Right, and they could reactivate again if policies start to go the wrong way again. If the perception is that new sanctions on Iran start to negatively affect Europe, or some other, maybe perhaps even more convoluted process taking place that makes life for the average French woman and French man more difficult, those protests will reactivate again. And the Yellow Vest protests also, they challenged that notion that the EU had a leader, the symbolic leader of the EU that would guide it forward the way Merkel had. They've delegitimized him.
I would definitely agree. And getting into the shaking of the EU, you will. Russia has made some significant moves in relation to Hungary and Italy in terms of trade agreements and diplomacy. And I'll start with the Hungarian one. It's a bit shorter than the Italian one. So last Thursday, Hungary signed a trade agreement that would deliver 2 billion cubic meters from Russia in natural gas and another 2 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Austria, of course, via Russia, starting next year. Now, Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó, who oversaw the signing of the agreement in St. Petersburg, said that the sanctions against Russia had been unsuccessful. Now, this followed Szijjártó's meeting with the Gazprom CEO, Alexei Miller. Now, the press release from that meeting noted that between the 1st of January and June 5th, so the past 6 months, Gazprom delivered 4.3 billion cubic meters of natural gas to Hungary, which is a 57.5% increase from last year, from that same time period last year. Now, consider all this happening despite Russia's dispute with Ukraine, especially over natural gas contracts.
Right.
It's noteworthy, too, that this is all happening at the same time while the EU is having a whole new issue with Turkey drilling off the coast of Cyprus. There's a clear, issue in trying to get natural gas and gas for all these countries around. And the problem with Turkey, the reason why they have a reason to agitate, is they've been trying to get into the EU for many years, but the EU won't allow them. And they would ostensibly be the first Islamic country in the EU. So there's a lot of reasons why that hasn't happened. But because it hasn't happened, Turkey's been, their economy is tanking right now. And so they have had to engage in drilling off the coast of Cyprus to the discontent of the EU. And we've talked about this in the past before about Turkey-Cyprus relations. And, Erdogan is willing to flex old Ottoman-esque, gravitas over that region. He's not afraid
The
to
Ottoman slap, if you will. You remember that old one. Which I do have to say, the Russia-Turkey dynamic is much stranger when you take Cyprus into account, because Russia has been stationing ships in Cypriot ports. Yet they've been also improving relations with Turkey, and of course the Cyprus crisis has been going on since 1974. So, not to sing the praises of Russia too much, but we could see a way where they might be able to finally broker a deal between the two.
Right. I think as long as the EU keeps Turkey out and the economy is floundering, you're going to see Turkey approach Russia even more so. Turkey is not backing down from the S-400 delivery, knowing that there will be sanctions and consequences from Washington. They are willing to stir trouble, with Syria because, as Perseus had just said, of the economic situation and the fact that Erdogan might be out soon. But I think this trajectory of where Turkey is going will eventually, it will have to um, probably side, I think, with Russia to some degree, like more than it is now. It's a conflictual relationship. It's a complex one. They don't always agree, but my belief is Turkey will continue to drift towards Russia, and more so as things become more difficult for it, with regards to its relationship to NATO and to EU. And at that point, that control of the Dardanelles is going to become enormously important all over again. It will have a new significance, but it'll have a new significance for the West.
Yes. I do have to say one thing I do appreciate about the new state of Russian-Turkish relations is the fact you could almost say, of course, it's adversarial. Turkey will punch above its weight. That's one thing I actually do admire about Erdogan, despite my general negative feelings about him. You could almost say that despite 150 years and despite the less than desirable outcome of the Crimean War, Russia finally subjugated the Turks.
Someone had to do it.
Yeah. Turkey names its drilling base the Janissary off the coast of Cyprus. just a trigger. Russia has to intervene. Can you tone it down, please?
But don't worry. France and the UK will be right there to defend Turkey for whatever reason. Just going back to the Crimea.
Yeah.
Honestly, I need to do a stream on the Crimean War, but that's aside the point. We have more news topics to get into, things that did not happen 150 years ago. So, Putin last week took a visit to Italy and met with Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte. Now, he also had a meeting with the Pope, but that was generally overshadowed by his meeting with the Italian government officials. Now, the meeting was generally warm, and the Italians also they redoubled their commitment to decreasing sanctions, getting rid of sanctions on the Russians. There was a minor impasse on the issue of Ukraine, however, with Putin saying the onus was on Ukraine and not Russia to solve the dispute. Now, Conte responded to this by saying, when President Putin, my friend Vladimir, says it doesn't all depend on Russia, he's being too modest. The truth is, Russia can play a major role in overcoming this dispute. Now, when you first read it without hearing the quote, it sounds like, oh, and Italy's pushing back on Russia. But it almost sounds like the Italians are saying, take more action, Ukraine. We don't care. We'll side with you in the European Union. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword comment, and I wasn't really sure how to read it at first.
Right, I think it's a compliment. I think he's basically saying, you're a big player. You can solve this. You have more influence than you think, and so on. That's the way I read it. And I would tend to think that's, very diplomatic and maybe even sincere. But I think generally it's a compliment.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting since the way the media painted it's like, oh, Italy pushed back on the Ukraine issue. They said, oh, Russia, you better play your part in Ukraine. But then you read the actual quote,
Yeah.
it's actually more pro-Russian than anything. Now,
right. It's also like the headlines, Rome on lockdown as Putin prepares to visit, right? And it's like, or alternatively, Rome is cleaned up.
Yeah, it's like,
streets have been washed. Putin is arriving. Like, both those things are true, and the truth is, both those things happen when any major dignitary is visiting the Pope.
I mean, it's like just there's increased security, increased heightened awareness in the wake of a diplomatic visit. I mean, we see this all the time. We see this when, we're not going to cover it today because not much of significance really happened, but Trump met with the Emir of Qatar yesterday. They did the exact same thing in D.C.
Yeah, like how, like this is protocol. I mean, they try to make it seem like it's out of the ordinary. Oh my God.
Now, of course, to insert their noses into the Russian-Italian diplomatic relationship, the new, I guess, say, improving relations between the two states. The liberal propaganda machine, this time specifically BuzzFeed, which, if you'll recall, they are the progenitors of the Steele dossier story, they tried to claim that Russia had funneled 65 million US dollars to Salvini and Lega, which is, of course, his political party. Now, this is a narrative similar to the one that destroyed the ruling coalition in Austria, Russian oligarchs giving money to the FPO in Austria, the populist far-right party. Now, Salvini has denied this, and the story hasn't had any noticeable impact on him or his party popularity. And funny enough, actually polling around the time the story came out, Lega's popularity was actually up by a couple points.
Italians are literally saying, "Good. I hope he did give us money." 65 million is not an awful lot. Like they're making a big stink about $65 million.
Yeah, I'm not sure what. I mean, of course, big money is in every political sphere, but I'm not sure how much that's worth in Italy. But just on the surface, it doesn't sound like that much.
No,
Now
I mean
it gets even better.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
It gets even better because do you know what their proof is of it?
No.
Okay, so they have a recording, but they're unable to identify the 3 Russians or the 2 Italian men on the recording, which is an hour and a half. Now, it was said to be made at a hotel in Moscow last fall to confirm whether Lega ended up receiving the money. So, one of the quotes from one of the Russians says, "Salvini is Italian, not Italian, but the European Trump." And now, this quote kind of debunks it for me, and I'll give my reasoning. This makes no sense for one specific reason. The Russian elite, Russian officials, were cautiously optimistic when Trump got elected and took office in regards to U.S.-Russian relations. But that optimism quickly evaporated, mainly on the first strikes in Syria. If they were so positive about the Italians and wanted to fund him or whatever, they would not be comparing Salvini to Trump. I don't think, if that's your sales pitch, it's not a very good one, especially considering the fact this meeting would have taken place in 2018, long after you could say Trump had been compromised.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, unless either of you have any other thoughts on the story, we can close out the show with the last 2 topics I have here.
Sure.
So,
hey, I actually have to get going, so you guys just finish up the show without me.
Yeah, we don't have much left, but yeah, it's nice been having you. Go take care of.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Good to have you.
Yeah, definitely. We'll do this again next week, and thank you to the audience. I will see you on Twitter.
Take care.
Okay, now that he's out right here, let's talk bad about him behind his back. No, but the show must go on. We have a show to continue. So, the U.S. and Russia have had, I guess you could say, a bit of willingness to work with each other on an arms agreement, especially on the Russian part. So, of course, Trump announced his intention to scrap the INF treaty back in October 2018, and he finally did it in early 2019. Now, recently, Russia followed suit with Putin signing a bill to suspend the INF on Russia's end. Now, during an interview with an Italian newspaper during his visit when he was in Rome, Putin said, quote, "I think that the achievement of a concrete agreement in the fields of arms control would contribute to strengthening international stability. Russia has the political will to work towards this. Now it's up to the United States." He also remarked on the U.S. scrapping the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002 and the upcoming expiration of the START Treaty in 2021. So there's been general positive rhetoric on the Russian part, and Putin said during his interview that when he met with Trump at the G20, it was very fruitful, very warm, and it seemed like there was going to be some progress made on an arms agreement. So here's to hoping.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, we've discussed this before, that the INF treaty has, the scrapping of it has more to do with China and containing China than it does, because it basically liberates America from being able it liberates America so that it's able to counter the kind of missile systems that China most certainly is developing now.
Yeah, but the
China was just not a player 30, 40 years ago when the treaty was signed. So
yeah, and some people have speculated that Russia was using China to test their missiles, And I mean, I imagine we've been doing the same thing with, for example, Japan and South Korea. But the interesting thing
Yeah.
is, like, I can, yeah, of course, if he wants to get the entire DC establishment on board, he's going to have to say, oh, we got to stand up to those Russians. But going into this, I don't think Trump really had a concrete plan on how to bring China into the agreement. Now, he announced his intentions, but I don't see how he had really a concrete plan to get them to sit down to sign arms control. I mean, some could argue that the trade war thing is with it, and he could be trying to use economic leverage to get China to the bargaining table on a missile treaty, but the way I see it is he hasn't really made any progress towards that beyond announcing his intention to do the State of the Union address back in February. Let's not even get back into that one. That brings up bad memories for me and probably you too, and probably for the rest of our audience, that is.
Mhm.
But yeah, like, okay, good in theory, good in intention, but what's your plan here? And I think it was a bit of an abrupt move, and of course we can say Bolton Pompeo, yes, but I don't know. It seems like they really dived headfirst into this, even though I can understand and appreciate the intentions.
Right. I think in many ways what it might signal is that for the moment there is a kind of a stalemate. That is, they can say that the meeting was fruitful. There will be some kind of possible treaty in the future to limit the arms race and so on, but that won't change NATO, performing, with thousands, tens of thousands of troops on the Russian border. Like, that will go on in perpetuity. Like, America will find new sanctions. So, like, I think a lot of this is just basic diplomacy, and you have to use the media to project this kind of competency within diplomacy.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with the fact that they could sign all the arms agreements they want. Once tensions rise, the agreements go out the window. They mean nothing. I mean, Russia started developing missiles in 2008 when the U.S. actually started to really push not only like NATO eastward, but started to move troops into Poland, into Romania, etc., and started to really get
Mm-hmm.
involved and committed to regime change in Ukraine. So, yeah, and again, I take the view that come the 2020s, a lot of U.S. foreign policy, maybe not necessarily all of it, but a lot of it is going to be untenable. So we might not see a complete withdrawal, but we may see like a downsizing in Europe just because we cannot sustain it, similar to the Soviet Union in the 80s where they really fell on hard times and they had to withdraw some of their assets from Eastern Europe. So we may see something like that, but yeah, ultimately it goes back to what I said about Trump a while ago, and the fact that you could sum up his entire presidency in rhetoric only. He's all these things in rhetoric only. He's tough on immigration rhetoric only. He's going to build that wall. He's going to say it. He's monitoring the situation. And it translates, of course, into his foreign policy, especially with Russia. Oh, we're going to be so great with the Russians, but we're also going to be as tough as we ever were on them, and I'm going to be so much tougher than Obama was on Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
That kind of rhetoric right there.
Right. You can have opposite ends, opposite purposes, cross purposes, and somehow, like, it will still work out. Like, literally, the world is Play-Doh. I can go in one direction where they're happy and another where they're not, and it's ridiculous, right? It's more of the schizophrenic policy that we've been talking about. Anyhow, but yeah.
And maybe I'm being too optimistic. Maybe I'm giving liberals too much credit. But I think a large part of the reason the Russian narrative actually died down is because the fact they looked at Trump's policy towards Russia, and there's no way they can construe this logically to anyone who's seen the fact that Trump is in bed with the Russians with the way U.S.-Russian relations have been going since 2017.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. There, what has changed policy wise towards Russia since the Obama era? Nothing really.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, the U.S. has only been when Trump says, "Oh, I've been tougher on Russia," he's got a point, but that doesn't make it a good thing.
Right. I mean, at least Obama didn't send troops. I mean, I don't recall an entire chunk of Syria occupied by Americans on the Iraqi border, so ISIS can go run there for cover.
Yeah, I mean, Obama, he gave millions upon millions to the Syrian rebels. That was his strategy, but he never wanted to take any direct action against Assad, or more appropriately, was barred from doing so by Congress. Whereas Trump is like, oh, I'm going to get out, I'm going to cut funding to rebels. Oh, we're going to put 5,000 troops in Syria. So it is interesting the fact that almost his openness to diplomacy and talking with our, I guess, say, quote unquote, adversaries, at least in the case of Russia, I would consider China more of an adversary, at least in the economic front, which we'll get into in a minute. It seems like his openness to diplomacy and solving things in negotiations has really backfired in the point where him, his cabinet, Congress has forced him to actually be more hawkish in these theaters.
Right, and he's had to do that. He's had to prove himself. So in a way, it's worked out for his detractors, but for like, the lower IQ liberals out there, basically, Putin stole the election from Hillary. Trump couldn't be happier, and for this, Putin and Russia must eternally pay. And they'll never be convinced that these events happened in any other way. Like they'll never be convinced that Trump's strategy to work to dominate the electoral vote and to campaign in the Rust Belt had something to do with it. It was really just Facebook memes, right?
Yeah.
They just can't forgive him because it's a completely emotional reaction.
And not to get straight too far on the subject, but also things like Russia didn't accept the liberalism culturally, socially, or economically.
Yeah.
It really it was a testament to the failure of their ideology. The fact that a country had tasted this in the '90s and early 2000s and spit it back out.
Right. Just think, if Russia had done that, like if Russia had become like Ukraine, or Poland, and the EU, which would entail America vis-a-vis NATO, of course, would stretch all the way to China and Alaska. Right. This is what Russia denied them by rejecting liberalism.
Ironically enough, it's actually a version of what some of the people on like the more alt-right white identitarian side, like where they want the global white empire, except the fact that the establishment just wanted it to have liberal values and gay marriage. So it's interesting that going back to that, Russia denied them being what it was under Yeltsin, because under Yeltsin they were hopeful that they were going to get something like that. They were moving towards that until, of course, Putin came to power. And look, say what you will about him, but at the very least he stands up for Russian influence on the world stage. That's one thing I got to give him respect for. Now, moving on from that, I do want to close out with some China news. So, Hong Kong specifically. Now, we talked about the protests there. As far as I'm concerned, I really don't care either way. It's like, look, if we're going to show this much damn concern about it, I know you made this counterpoint that, look, the Americans probably forced the British hand on this. But yeah, I mean, at this point, I wish if we were just going to show so much damn concern that the Western powers would have just kept control of it. But beyond that, I couldn't really care less about Hong Kong. But the leader of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, has announced that the extradition bill, which was the cause of these protests, had been scrapped. Now, of course, yeah, I don't think it's off the table, but I think they probably are appeasing it. We'll probably see it in a few months, a year from now. But more interestingly enough, it's speculated that at the G20, Trump agreed not to voice support or offer any kind of aid to the protesters in Hong Kong, so long as China was cooperative on trade talks. Now, this narrative, however, is contradicted by the fact that Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo met with Jimmy Lai, who was one of these main figures, one of these main pro-democracy figures for Hong Kong, in a move that angered Beijing. Now, no surprise, the White House is internally divided. And as you were saying, you were probably right when you said this a few weeks back. This may have been on the lost recording, so we may not have that, knock on wood, that this doesn't happen to this one. But the U.S. may be willing to budge in Hong Kong and let them free, but they're willing to draw the line at Taiwan, which is evidenced by the arms deal, which we'll be discussing soon.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Hong Kong is just not, it's not relevant in the way that it was in the 90s. Beijing has solidified its power over China. This is obvious now. Like, thank you, Hong Kong. You were useful. Hong Kong, of course, is used to, a different culture with it's still essentially Chinese, but it has an enormous amount of Anglo influence and ideas. I would say it's definitely more liberal than the rest of China. But China is not it's not going to play games. China doesn't play games.
Yeah, I mean, in the eyes actually of someone like a Trump, someone like the Western leaders, Hong Kong served its purpose. It served that spearhead for Western business into China rapidly, and now that that's done, I mean, it's the 2010s. We're almost at the end of the 2010s. That was the 1990s. It served its purpose. Who cares what China has from the Western perspective? And honestly, I take that perspective. Now, again, I know some like the Anglos, for like national pride reason, will be more opposed to that. And look, fair enough, I can understand that. But from an American standpoint, it's like, okay, yeah, China's an economic rival. China has influence abroad, but I'll get into this with the Taiwan stuff. But why do we need to be having this, just like picking little foreign policy similar to what you see on the Russian border? It's like, look, yeah, oppose China all you want, oppose them economically, oppose their influence here. But you don't need to be giving Stinger missiles to Taiwan or supporting an uprising in Hong Kong to be opposed to China.
Right. It's a it's a way of Trump. I'm sure. Well, American intelligence has been using those protests the way it used the Tibet protests and the free Tibet concerts from like the late '90s, early 2000s, and that's just statecraft. They're going to do that. But,
yeah, it's the equivalent of like the Confucius Institute, which is the Chinese-funded like academia organization over here. So again, it's just small, really insignificant things where we just pick at each other. Nothing too harmful on either side.
Right. Like China has this. Like protesters in Hong Kong are not going to bring down like a 5,000-year-old civilization. Like, I hate to break it to people. Like,
I mean, unless we start pumping more opium there. I mean, look, that might do it. Even though I think that might have been tried already.
yeah. Like things that once happened, but no, it's not gonna. Yeah.
Now, just to cover briefly on U.S.-China trade talks, so they've once again resumed. Now, to put it in perspective, since this time last week when we announced that they resumed, they grinded to a halt within that week and are now back on as of today. So, as I've said before, Trump has been very inconsistent on China lately, likely pointing to an ongoing dispute in his administration, as we saw with Pompeo and Pence meeting with, of course, the pro-democracy publisher from Hong Kong. And this is this news, I would say, backs up, especially when coupled with the arms sale to Taiwan. Again, it goes back to that schizophrenic policy, as you called it. We can't decide whether we want to go all tough on China, or we're going to be very militaristic towards the Chinese, whether, we're going to stand up for an economic interest, or, we're going to negotiate a new trade deal. Trump keeps on oscillating between these, again, in cycles in less than a week. So I imagine someone like a Bolton. I imagine someone like a Bolton saying, "Look, give those missiles to Taiwan," whereas Pompeo saying, "Oh, you got to support those protesters," and Trump's like, "Look, I just want a trade deal. I just want to make things more, equitable economically between our two countries because China's been completely screwing us over in trade for decades now." So I imagine those are like the three narratives in the White House. Of course, each of them have their own support. But moving on to the Taiwan arms deal, unless you have any thoughts on the Chinese trade issue.
No, I mean Trump just wants the grill. Like, enough with the geopolitics of. By grill, I mean a euphemism for trade. Trump's right about this. Actually, he his focus on just trade and maybe using the protests in order to influence trade talks is like the right approach, truthfully speaking. So.
Yeah,
but that's all I have to say.
Just enough pressure to get him to talk, to get him to stop exploiting, the entire wonky trade agreements. And, I would say trade talks that are proper memorial to good old Ross Perot, who we did lose this week. I made a video on that. So, for those of you in the chat, I know this is pre-recorded, but just give me an F for Ross Perot, just with that out of the way.
Yeah.
Now, the last story I wanted to cover was the U.S. State Department had approved a possible sale of Taiwan for M1 A2T Abrams tanks, Stinger missiles, and other related equipment at an estimated value of $2.2 billion, the Pentagon said on Monday. Now, the weapons that were originally requested by Taiwan included 108 Abrams tanks, 250 Stinger missiles, and the Taiwanese claimed it would also not alter the military balance of the region, which was followed up by the Pentagon Defense Council, Pentagon Defense Security Cooperation Agency. My apologies. They put that up in their statement. Now, needless to say, China was none too pleased about the recent agreement. Now, on Tuesday, the Chinese foreign minister had quite a tirade about this arms agreement, and he said that Beijing had lodged formal complaints through diplomatic channels expressing their strong dissatisfaction and resolute opposition to the proposed sale. Now, he called the proposed deal a, quote, crude interference in Chinese internal affairs that, quote, harmed China's sovereignty and security interests. He added, quote, China urges that the U.S. immediately cancel the planned arms sales and stop military relations with Taipei in order to avoid damaging Chinese-U.S. relations and harming peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. No one should underestimate the Chinese government and people's firm determination to defend the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity and to oppose foreign interference. Now, look, I can understand if Trump was like, oh, we'll sell Taiwan arms. Oh, we'll do it if you don't cooperate. But actually going through with it, you sort of throw away the bargaining chip. I mean, you throw that away since once you do it, it's a one-time thing. So if you ask me, he gave on way too soon. I have no problem with the threat. I have no problem playing hardball with other countries, especially in economic negotiations. But he could have said, Mr. Xi, if you do not come to the negotiation table, if we do not work out a comprehensive trade agreement, I'll have no choice but to sell arms to Taiwan. But instead he just went through and said, I'm selling arms to Taiwan. You want to talk about trade?
Right. Now, this strategy is kind of, in some ways, not all that different than the strategy that's being used against Russia and China, right? It's an embargo, encirclement, threatening strategy with double talk, right? And it's literally what has forced things like the creation of the Instax, right? It's literally what has forced Russia and China to work much more cooperatively than they ever have had in their history, right? There's no option, right? Like you can see as an outsider, there's what's the bargaining? Like what do I get out of it? Of course, China has, I think, ambitions to bring Taiwan back into the fold. That it's it's an important historical land tied to China, to Chinese history, and so on. But the truth is, I think China should wisely, I think, avoid it, because so far Taiwan has not been instrumental in stopping China's man-made islands or the new trading routes that are being developed. And the One Belt, One Road has at least three and a half belts, and one of them is the Seaway, but the other one will be across Central Asia. And that one, in the end, may prove to be definitely the more secure one.
Yeah, I think China's future is
well,
inland.
We'll see how it. Yeah, it's inland, and of course, Russia can facilitate this. Russia can, in this regard, is a good partner. So China can avoid Taiwan. It doesn't, like, Taiwan isn't going to, create embargoes that it can't enforce. The Philippines are not on board. Duterte is threatening America to start a war. How dare you? So you know what I mean? And like,
yeah, I mean, but strangely
China
enough,
hasn't stopped
Vietnam
building
is,
islands.
so.
So yeah. So I think a lot of this Taiwan represents like an ambition. It's really something that China is aiming for in the future. But they're not going to get it by, like, what I'm saying is China isn't going to acquire Taiwan, but only if Taiwan doesn't have like the latest missiles. Like it's not going to happen that way. It will happen because there's a kind of ipso facto, supremacy of Chinese culture down the road that Taiwan is able to, um, be brought back into the mainland China fold, as it were, right? But it's like militarily, it isn't going to happen.
Right, and people are still stuck in the mindset of third generation warfare that we saw
Yeah,
in World War II. But we're in fourth generation warfare. If there's going to be a conquest of Taiwan, it's going to be a soft conquest. It's going to be where it becomes either so appealing or they have no choice but to reunify with mainland China. Now, going back in terms of historical mistakes, I just said if we're going to be so damn concerned about it, why would we give Hong Kong? Well, I also say, if we were going to be so damn concerned about it, why didn't we just let the Japanese keep Taiwan? But that again, joking aside, it's interesting that you were bringing up the point about how Russia and China have been forced together into an axis, because that's a point that, of course, Colonel Douglas McGregor, who is a favorite of Tucker Carlson, and who is speculated that, he may replace Bolton as national security advisor. Now, I don't put much stock into that, but there were some articles going around that, Trump, big fan of Fox News, big fan of Carlson, may talk to this guy, former colonel, very decorated, very distinguished career, may have him on the National Security Council or replace someone like Bolton, or putting him somewhere in the administration. Now, the reason I bring him up is the point he made is, yeah, Russia and China historically have not gotten along. Maybe not necessarily enemies, but they historically have not been the strongest of allies. I mean, they were briefly under Stalin and Mao, but of course, after Stalin died, there was a split between the Soviet Union and China, which led to the war in Afghanistan, Brzezinski, all of that, to where we are today. So it is a bit funny, in our obsession to try to contain both, we have made them even more powerful.
right. And like, think about it. They have, like, the one thing stopping these trade routes, right? Like, this is very historic because almost every great empire has relied on waterways, first with rivers, then small inland seas, whether it's the Black Sea or the Mediterranean, even the Caspian, right? And then finally, open oceans, right? The one belt, one road, right, is in many ways it's phenomenal because it's so inland, it's so part of the heartland of the tectonics of the earth, if you will, stretching from Asia to Europe, right? That it's unassailable. You're not going to just contain it with carriers all around the shores from the Arctic to the South Pacific. It's unassailable. So long term, this is you can see that the investments for Russia and China into the future require that this is constructed. I mean, and it is being constructed. So that will force America, in order to stop this process, first of all, to stay in Afghanistan absolutely permanently, but also Turkmenistan. Maybe play influences in Tajikistan, and as they have.
And
It's the only
Kazakhstan
way
with his
to.
recent leadership shakeup. I mean, Nazarbayev has resigned. Now, granted, he resigned of his own accord. He has loyalists in power. He's still in the National Security Council there. But point being is, I mean, whenever you get any of these kind of leadership changes, even if it's completely legitimate, it still opens up for instability. I mean, look, Zelensky was completely legitimately elected, but look at how unstable Ukraine has become just because of all the external pressure coupled with a transfer in administration.
Yeah, you're right. So, if in the immediate future the One Belt One Road ends in Kaliningrad and Belarus, so be it. I mean, Nord Stream 2 also, has a passage through the North Sea. But in time, and things seem to be developing this way, countries like Hungary, for instance, Slovakia, even Czech Republic are becoming quite warm to Russia. So, the possibilities of trade and more direct trade going all the way across the great, Eurasian landmass, the technology is there and it can be done. So, the waterways that formerly, the British and American empires have controlled become less relevant.
Yeah, I would agree. And just for my final thought on the subject, I see with the, I guess you could say, decline of America's global influence, especially going into the coming decades, look, Russia and China, I don't think they'll become like rivals or enemies overnight. But I see without the unifying factor of being opposed to the U.S., I could see sort of a love-hate relationship developing where, look, they'll cooperate on some things, but look, my point being is I see, especially if American power wanes as fast as I would anticipate it to, I could see a lot of tension growing between Russia and China once that unifying factor is gone.
That's a very strong possibility. That's a very, very strong possibility. You know, maybe this is something that's only has a future for the next like 50, 60, 70 years. You know, that's possible. Um, that's a definite possibility. On the other hand, it could mean that uh, you know, we go back to, you know, the Silk Road that we had in antiquity and in the Middle Ages. There's no reason why that can't start up again. So that's possible. Maybe you'll have countries that, you know, for a few centuries are all part of it, but, you know, it's hard to tell right away. But I would agree with you that part of this is both the pressure from the states plus the perception that the states can no longer wield the kind of power it once could. So both factors are um, contributing to this partnership. But I see the partnership as something actually like valid, even despite that.
Yeah, I mean,
Right? Like
especially between
like in and of itself, it is like a it's a worthwhile economic project, especially for two essentially, you know, land based and traditional societies like the Russians and the Chinese.
yeah,
Where
I would
like
definitely agree. And one thing I will say, especially with the, I wouldn't necessarily call it personal, but professional relationship you have between people, someone like a Putin and Xi Jinping, I could see Russian Chinese relations being good at least on that front. And if their acolytes, if you will, succeed them, I could see that continuing. But if there's a shift in faction, a ruling faction in one of these countries, I mean, because look, I mean, we could say political parties, but both being authoritarian states, which I don't knock them for, I really don't care. We could see a shift in ruling factions where one is more opposed to the other. But point being is, yeah, I
oh,
agree.
it can spoil.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely, it can be spoiled.
I would say it's a friendship, but a fragile friendship. And with that, I'll close out the show. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I feel like this has been very rich, deep
Thanks,
discussions.
everyone.
See you guys next time, and goodbye.